Okay, we are now recording, and I want to thank everyone for joining. We're going to continue to allow people in as they come in a little bit late, since this is mostly a Q&A session. I will continue to move people from the waiting room into the event, and everyone is on mute and is unable to unmute themselves. So please put your questions in the chat, and we'll address them one by one as we go through them. And I will turn it over to our ringmaster, Charlie, now.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this Wednesday evening. Especially thank you to William for taking his time out with his family to do this with us, and also for Todd for hosting it on the Wine Berserker Zoom. You all know William Kelley by now, one of the prominent critics in the wine world, working with the Wine Advocate. And he's taken some time today to answer some questions that we have. We're going to do a process of everyone, if they want, type in the chat, and then Todd and I will take turns asking the questions out to William. This will kind of allow the flow of information to go a little quicker. We're going to start with a few kind of general questions for William, just to kind of get everything started, because I think most people will have very specific questions they want to ask. Yeah, so, thank you, William, for coming. And kind of how we started interacting was on Wine Berserkers and on social media. So I kind of want to segue into asking, you use social media in a way that other wine professionals don't. Maybe it's because of your relative youth in comparison, but how do you view your use of social media as a way to grow not just the Wine Advocate, but your own, William Kelley brand?
Well, I'd say for me, it's simply very interesting to actually be able to interact and engage with people who are reading my work. We were just discussing it before we began, and we have a comment section underneath our articles on the site. People who really want to can write in, can find my email address or whatever. But being on Instagram, especially, then also being on Wine Berserkers is a great way to have interactions with people, to know what people are really interested in, and it's very stimulating. I mean, I can publish an article about 2019 Burgundy on the Wine Advocate website, and I make an ex-cathedra pronunciation. That's my view. Voila, I've said my piece, but I don't really have any pushback. I don't have any questions, any interrogation. So I find it very stimulating, actually, to go onto the forum and have those kinds of discussions, and to sometimes be challenged. People say, we disagree with this, whatever. I find that very thought-provoking and a great way to sort of work out ideas almost informally before writing articles or before revising articles, because what we do, and I think that's fundamental to how I conceive of wine writing. It's never definitive, this notion that we create perfect wines and give them 100 points, and it's finished. It's not like that. You taste the wine from barrel, you taste it from bottle, you taste it 20 years later. It's a constant process of putting things into question again, reappraising, reevaluating. I think to be serious, rather than sort of arrogating this power to make and break wines. So I find it very interesting that in that sort of way, it's just a way to communicate with people who actually are interested in what I'm doing.
Also, it seems like an easier way to communicate opposed to someone having to write like an essay on a wine tasting, right?
Absolutely, and sometimes it's kind of fun. It's fun to just exchange a few words about something. It's enough. It doesn't. And kind of formal email or whatever.
Playing in tie with that, like how do you use video and audio to better educate consumers on domains?
Well, that's something. Yeah, it's something I noticed. Especially, I've been wanting to do it this year anyway, and with the lockdown, I was sort of stimulated to do some video presentations. I want to take it a lot further, to do some stuff with drones in Burgundy in the vineyards, to get producers in, to really try to show people the vineyards, because when you walk through the vineyards in Burgundy, a lot of things suddenly make sense. When you see the different parcels, if you know whose parcels are what, if you see the changes in exposition. When you walk around Montrachet, on the map, Montrachet just looks like this block, huh? But when you walk through Montrachet, you see, when you come to the border between Pilliniche to Saint-Marché, where the first DRC parcel is, the ground falls away, the exposition changes, everything's different. So to sort of it's very difficult to communicate those things verbally or in writing, even if one's reasonably adept at that sort of thing. So yeah, I want to try to open things up in that regard. I also think people have short attention spans these days, you know, and if I could publish a 3,000 word essay on any number of subjects, and even if I can read it in one sitting, it doesn't mean that many people are going to have time or the volition to do that. There are very few things in the wine world that are so complicated you can't make some sort of statement about them in 5 minutes in a video. Honestly, you know, it's not particle physics.
Do you find like the producers you're doing videos with, are they receptive to this idea of doing videos, or is there a little bit of like reticence in the beginning?
Well, people are shy, you know, and I mean, I naturally, I used to have to in school, dramatic performances, I used to have to be dressed as a fish and play the tambourine in the background because I was too shy to have a speaking part, you know. So this is not my forte naturally by any means, and quite a lot of producers are not used to that sort of thing for sure. But when the point of it is to show people the vineyards that they wouldn't otherwise get to see, then I think everyone's interested. And you know, and that I've only done a couple like that, but someone like Cedric Bouchard, you know, nobody goes to visit vineyards in the Haut. Someone like Vincent Duroy, nobody goes to visit vineyards in Ruiz. It's not like let's do a tour of Romanée-Conti with a bit of Hélène. It's let's go a little bit further off the beaten path and see some things that people might not have seen or even seen photos of or even thought to look at.
Have you had like more like traditional producers like reach out to you to do some like video media?
Not particularly. I mean, I think I have quite a formal relationship with a lot of these producers, at least to start with. I think they're sometimes, you know, it's very much vous rather than tu when we meet, and that changes as we get to know each other for sure. But I think, you know, they're used to having rather formal relationships with wine critics, where they see a wine critic once a year. The wine critic tastes the wines, doesn't say anything, and then goes away, and then they find out 2 months later, you know, whether apparently they had Brett in all of their wines or whatever, you know. So no, I don't. Nobody's really sort of solicited me like that. But I think I get the feeling people wouldn't mind doing more, actually, for the most part. You know, I think even some rather discreet people would be kind of coyly flattered to be asked, honestly. For them it's nice because, you know, they can reach a far bigger audience for the given expenditure of time. They don't have to take 50 people throughout the year on 50 separate occasions around their vineyards. They can do it once, and a lot of wine lovers can see. So
I kind of see domestic producers seem to embrace it a little bit more, especially with like, I guess, non-professional wine critics. You see a lot of like Instagram, you know, wine influencers or whatever, interacting with domestic producers. Do you think there's a space for that, you know, as a way to impart positivity in the wine community by non-professional wine critics?
Yeah, I mean, why not? And you know, a lot of wineries have marketing budgets, and they've got samples to send to people and whatever, and it's kind of a fun, it's a fun side project, I would think. I doubt many people are going to make a very viable living out of it. I can testify that particularly at my time at the Canter magazine, there's not very much money in wine writing, even when you know, have some sort of more or less reputable job title. But I don't know. Yeah, I think it'll be, yeah, as you said, it'll be very different with the domestic wine in the US versus, you know, people in Burgundy are not really going to start doing that anytime soon, I don't think. I think you'll see places like the Château de Pommard, they're a bit more savvy, will do things like that. But you know, I don't think Cocherie is about to get even an Instagram account anytime soon. I'd love it. It'd be pretty fun.
I'll be the first one in line. They can send me some samples if they want.
Yeah, right.
We'll kind of open it up in a few moments, but you know, it was kind of a last question for you, just in a generality sense. Is there a trend you've enjoyed seeing in 2020 among the producers that you review that you hope continues on in the future?
I know it's a slightly mundane point, but I suddenly get the impression that more and more producers are up for moving towards tasting finished wines in bottle with me. And that's something I've been sort of slowly pushing for. It's just much more reliable. You know, I mean, I make my own wine in Burgundy and in California, and I get to taste, you know, when I'm in Burgundy, I taste my own wine when I do the topping once a week. So I see the evolution over from the period of harvest to the time I finish my reviews. I see the evolution over a 3-month period, and it changes every week. So I think I'm acutely aware of the fallibility of reviewing expensive, very expensive wines from barrel, and the temptation when you're tasting a wine that's a bit inscrutable from barrel is to fall back on appellation hierarchy, producer reputation, what the wine normally is like, and then you just end up with a very repetitive, sort of iterative kind of wine writing that says the same things every year. So I find it more interesting tasting from bottle. I find more and more producers in Burgundy are up for doing that. So, you know, it's a slightly mundane thing. We can also talk a bit about, I hope there'll be some questions about evolving viticulture in Burgundy. I mean, that's not a 2020 phenomenon, but it's something that's really changed a lot just in the last 3 years that I've been living there, and that's something that I think we're in an exciting moment in the history of Burgundy in that regard.
Cool. We'll pass on to Todd to ask the first question. I think we have Howard Cooper.
Yep, Howard Cooper.
Great.
It's Howard C. I assume it's Howard Cooper. Correct me if I'm wrong in the chat, Howard C. What is your view of the 2019 vintage in Burgundy for both reds and whites? Are there vintages that you would compare this to?
Good question. That's what I've been working on all day, and so often after writing up 50 tasting notes,
well, then you're uniquely qualified to answer. Right?
No, I think it's a very interesting vintage. It's a sunny vintage. It's a rich vintage. It's a ripe vintage. But compared to 15, 18, and I think even looking back to 5 and 9, to me, it's more exciting. It's livelier. There's a real sense of energy to the best wines. People could, of course, make these monsters and these overbearing, high alcohol, 16% sort of troglodytic ink pots, but that wasn't necessary. Absolutely, you know, there are a lot of producers who kept it below 13.5. So I encourage people to taste the wines before they make up their mind, because it's really easy. You know, we went from a wine discourse that privileged ripeness and structure and power to one that is absolutely the opposite of that. And any wine that can be tarnished by association with ripeness becomes sort of, you know, hyper scrutinized. I think, you know, I was just writing up my tasting notes on the 2019s from Lafarge. They're beautiful wines. I'm going to buy a lot of them, and I warmly recommend them. You know, maybe if I'm wrong, I'm going to be the first person to be disappointed with a lot of the 19s, because there's an energy to them. The white side of the ledger is a bit more variable, simply because the yields were low. They ripen really quickly. There are some high alcohol wines where you feel the alcohol. I won't deny that. But there are also some wines that have a lot of concentration of flavor, but also acidity, because what happened in 19, it was really that the drying north wind in you know, warm but not super hot weather in the last couple of weeks of the season that caused this concentration. It wasn't the same as in 18, when it was hot weather towards the end, sort of baking things. So it's different. That I think that explains why the wines are fresher, more dynamic, more incisive. And it was, after all, it was a mid-September harvest. This is very classic. I think I mentioned in a post the other day, if you look in the 18th century writings of Dom Denis, the monk who wrote a rather interesting little treatise about Burgundy, says the best wines come from a mid-September harvest. Well, that was 2019. So it's not a radical departure from the sort of deeper historical norms of the region by any means, you know. So I think it's an exciting vintage. And I don't think it would have been controversial if it had arrived 20 years ago. Personally, I would be, you know, if we really want to sort of scrutinize and tear apart a vintage, I'd rather tear apart 2005 than
get in line for that. Yeah.
Well, why not? I mean, and a lot of people said this is the best vintage of our careers, whether producers, commentators, merchants, importers said that about 2005. I think a lot more 19s will fulfill their promise than 2005s at the end of the day. It's my view. We'll see.
And reds overall, as a whole, reds are probably more likely to be a success. Whites a slightly more?
I think it really depends, but you know, but I think one of the stories of Burgundy in the last 30 years has been the complete impossibility, increasing impossibility of making any kind of generalizations. You can no longer generalize about the Côte de Beaune versus the Côte de Nuit. You certainly cannot generalize about one commune versus another, and even to generalize about colors or whatever, it's just impossible. When you have you know, people Charles Lachaux's Echezeaux coming in at like 12.6, and Emmanuel Rouget is at 16.8. Well, okay, they're both Echezeaux, they're both 2019. What more is there to say beyond that? You know, so you really can't. Yeah, I really struggled more and more. Well, but it makes it very difficult to write a vintage report. In fact, I can write a lot of tasting notes and feel rather confident about the assessments in the notes, because I think I was tasting well this year. I'm better than when I reviewed the 18s or the 17s, because one learns every year for sure. But to say anything about the vintage overall is harder and harder every year, I think.
Okay, Charlie, you're up next.
Yeah, Nick Ellis has a question. Can you tell us a little bit about your own Burgundy project? Where are the vines? You know, what
Sure.
are you doing that's kind of standing out in your own winemaking?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, and I don't talk about it that much because I try to avoid appearing to exploit my position to promote it. But since you asked, thanks for asking. The idea is to kind of make the sort of wines that I like to drink and perhaps can't always afford, although admittedly living in the region, my access is better than it was when I was living elsewhere. So we work with, you know, small quantities. You can't get big quantities of really great fruit. You know, so the idea is to get grapes that aren't normally for sale, even. And when I buy my Chambol from very old vines, and the Ludia Foucher from Gilbert Felletic, who went organic this year. You know, really great vine genetics. We choose the harvest dates. You know, I'm there, and then in terms of the vinification, the idea is to make something incredibly classic. And rather old-fashionedly traditional, actually. So we do quite a bit of the manual destemming a la Loire, where you cut out the raki and keep the pedicels, but not 100% that. So about 2/3 like that. Then a fermentation in a wooden tank, used wooden tank for, you know, we do pretty longer and longer macerations. You know, I'm kind of more and more interested in very long macerations, but without any kind of artificial extraction. You know, maceration gets a bad word when we talk about winemaking, but nobody talks about extraction enzymes or heating or all the things people do to make very extracted wines during these long macerations. I'm kind of convinced you get very interesting things happening in a long and natural maceration. So we just let we don't chill it, we don't heat it at any point, we don't add anything. And there's a moment I found after 3 weeks where the wine really changes, and you get all sorts of sort of sapid aromas. The color of the wine changes. Everything comes into place. It begins to even to clarify, and then you get a much better also free run juice yield when you go to press. So we use very little press wine. Do it in a vertical basket press, then into barrels about 50% new oak. I mean, really good barrels. We're lucky with the access we have to barrels. And then you're moving towards, longer maceration and then longer élevage. So 2019 is going to spend 2 years in barrel, and then be bottled by hand directly from the barrel with the Chèvre du Bec, they call it. So it couldn't, you know, and then corked from Francisco Segura, the best corks you can get. Something as artisanal as possible is kind of what I'm interested in producing.
Okay. I've got a question from Maxwell. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry if that was too much detail.
No, I don't think you have to worry about that. Not with this crew. Maxwell Swomley has a question. Have you tasted many wines out of Oregon? And he references Goodfellow, Patricia Green, Vincent, Berserker shout out. And how does what they're doing compare to what you see in Burgundy? Also, are there any producers that stand out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I've spent a bit of time in Oregon. I reviewed it briefly for Decanter. I've been to IPNC a few times, and yeah, I tasted not all, but some of the wines you cite there. I know that most of those producers would hate direct comparison with Burgundy, because that's sort of the cross that you have to bear if you make Pinot Noir in Oregon. Equally, sometimes it seems to me, if you want to plant Burgundian grape variety, use Burgundian winemaking techniques, Burgundian barrels, and then Burgundian shaped bottles, well, it's kind of inviting comparison, isn't it? Oh, and but be that as it may, I think that they do end up tasting very different. I'm a big fan actually of John Thomas's wines, so I like those a lot. I like especially Irie Vineyards a lot, but I'm a bit less in touch. Walter Scott wines a lot as well for the Chardonnays, but I'm a bit less in touch with what's going on now. I don't know. I think the Chardonnays can maybe have a more Burgundian profile if you're looking for something that's a real lookalike dead ringer in a blind tasting for a Burgundian wine. But maybe that's just because Chardonnay is a bit more malleable, and if you get the barrel program right and a few things about the pressing right, you can make Chardonnay taste quite Burgundian in most places that are suitable for growing it. It's not far from saying everywhere it's grown, but yeah, I don't know. I'd hesitate to sort of make too many generalizations. I find in general the wines are a bit more ampler, not necessarily richer. A lot of Burgundy wines are much more extracted than most Oregon Pinots, but they have more mid-palate amplitude, often with a sort of suppler, more enveloping sort of profile, a bit less tight-knit, young. I mean, I don't think I've ever tasted an Oregon Pinot that was as tight and dense and introverted as young red Burgundy can be, although it is less and less like that, in fairness.
Wow. Let's see why you're a writer.
I don't know about that. But
it's amazing. Wow, I'm sold on all of it right now. So, all right, Charlie, you're up.
So Charles Heitzel has a question in regards to your thoughts on how different your wine writing and critical approaches with Wine Advocate in comparison to your days at the canner.
Oh, well, I think I've got better. I hope I've got better. I mean, I hope I get better every year. And in a sense, the real important learning experience for me has been more making wine. Obviously, tasting large quantities of wine, you ought to get better at something by repeating it. But for me, that's not necessarily true. What you really need is some sort of corrective mechanism that makes you improve. You can repeat something. If you don't know if it's getting better or not, why do you improve? And so for me, that has been tasting my own wine during élevage and getting a read on how it evolves, and seeing how I can better understand cues in the wines that then I'm tasting myself, frankly. I think also there have been important learning experiences looking at the 16 vintage in Burgundy, where, especially in the Côte de Beau and some very frosted vines. I made a bit of wine with some friends in 2016. There was a bit of rot. Acidities were very high, maturities rather marginal, sub 12 degrees, potential alcohol. And you think, is this ever really, should we have made rosé? What's going to come of this? And then you taste 2016 red Burgundies and wow, And then it was the same with 17, very high yields. I mean, yields really that are higher than one is led to believe should be optimal. And you think, and the wines can be a little fluid, especially when they were young. They were a little fluid. I remember very vividly. There was not much to sort. Sanitary conditions were very good, but there just wasn't. There was they were a bit juicy. The red. I'm talking about the Pinot Noir here. And then again, you taste 17s. 17s today. I mean, they're sumptuous, expressive, fine, and so you learn from all of those things. But I'd say that in terms of the technical side of things, in terms of a technical tasting, which barrel tasting is the most technical kind of tasting you can do, that I think I'm much better at now than I was last year, the year before, and that for me is very important. The other big changes, I mean, at the Advocate, I write fewer long form essays, so I don't know. I mean, I think I'm becoming progressively more and more illiterate. And I can write tasting notes, and I try to make tasting notes sound a bit different each time. And but there's a limit to how many variations you can get in when you have to write 2,000 for one article. So that I think maybe I'm losing my polish as a writer because I don't get to write anymore. But we'll see. Maybe I think I need to write a book or something.
Go for it. I'm sure you'll have plenty of Berserkers will be buying it too. So
well, that would be great.
okay, we're going to switch a little bit here to climate change. Joel Singer has a question about that, and how much does climate change emerge as an issue in your visits with winemakers in Burgundy?
Yeah, I think we're talking about it a lot the last few years, obviously, because while they're precedents for all of the things that we've seen in the last 3 years, to have them successively, and now there's not really a precedent for that, and you begin to see the accumulated impact of dry years on the vines with certain rootstocks dying, you know. So I think in a way we're entering into a period in Burgundy where I draw the analogy with when phylloxera hit Napa in the late 80s. And there were a lot of ideas circulating in the late 80s in Napa about doing viticulture differently. In retrospect, perhaps some of them were mistaken, but there were a lot of people wanted to change a lot of things. And suddenly phylloxera hit, and there was this reason to replant pretty much the whole valley. And everything looked different within 5 to 10 years. And I think in Burgundy, you're going to see a lot of replanting due to rootstock issues. And I think a lot of people will be also rethinking trellising, density, choices of mazals, pruning strategies, a lot of things. Perhaps not as much as in Napa, because you know, the appellation system means that you have fewer options, honestly, and perhaps also, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things that are in question right now. There are people making great wines with high density plantings. Olivier Lamy's Densité White Burgundy is some of the most exciting white wines in Burgundy. Yet, in a drought situation, the last thing you want is high density. And so there are a lot of these issues that, you know, even sometimes the things that the most innovative people are doing, is it actually the right direction, or is it completely the wrong direction? So it's really a moment of reflection, introspection in Burgundy suddenly, and suddenly the viticultural landscape begins to look different. You see, riding up and down the coast, you see vines trained to stakes on échalas, you see higher canopies, you see all sorts of things you didn't see 5 years ago outside of, you know, a few small band of producers, you know, La Louise-Loire, but also Pascal Roblet and Volnay, and a few people, but, you know, most of whom were not really talked about with the exception of Loire. And today, everyone's talking about it. Everyone's putting it on their winery Instagram as well. So yeah, it's a big deal.
So Sean Sidney has a question about vine material, particularly about vine material in Burgundy, and the influence and importance of vine material in Burgundy. And if you feel like, since there's only been a few clones, that there is limiting because of that type of vine material. And
yeah, I mean, if you want to do a little sort of potted history, clearly before phylloxera there was immense genetic diversity in Burgundy. Phylloxera was a genetic bottleneck, and a lot of, in fact, if you look at the stuff that was planted in the 1890s on the first American rootstocks, often it wasn't as fine quality as the stuff people had honed in on by the 1930s. So that firstly, the imperative after phylloxera was simply to make wine. And secondly, it takes time to really know how your selections are going to mature, to really dial in on the sort of superior strains to propagate. The clonal movement was a bit like phylloxera, in that was a genetic bottleneck and a lot of genetic diversity was lost, but enough good stuff has been preserved and people are really working at it now. I think Pinot Noir inherently is much more genetically mutable than Chardonnay. That for me, you know, the bigger question is in some ways about Chardonnay. I'm convinced that with Mazar selections of Pinot Noir, you can do a lot to offset these riper, sunnier, drier vintages. If you get the rootstock and the Mazar right, I think there's a lot of potential, and I mean, that's borne out by the freshness of some of the 2019 reds, especially. Chardonnay, you know, even this notion that white Burgundy is Chardonnay, I talk about sometimes the varietalization of white Burgundy, which was really cemented by the appellation system, saying that it's, you know, most of the appellations are Chardonnay. There are some with Pinot Blanc, whatever the other things, but historically the reality was not that at all. There was Pinot Blanc. You know, there's a famous producer of Merceau who still has a hectare of Pinot Blanc. There was Aligoté, there was Pinot Gris, there were all manner of different things. And I think these sort of essentially a Chardonnay dominant field blend can be much more resilient and much more capable of producing sort of fresher, dynamic wines in hotter years than 100% Chardonnay, and especially 100% clonal Chardonnay. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, they can ask again if it doesn't, so that's easy.
Exactly, yeah.
So one from Julie C. In the States for Pinot, we're able to get tech sheets, etc. In Burgundy, the information is not quite so transparent. How would you advise it? How would you advise a new wine berserker? And Julie, you're no longer new. We've been on every single one of these Zoom sessions, so you can't call yourself new anymore. How would you advise a new wine berserker to get access to information about the vine age, clones, etc. for Burgundy?
Sure. I mean, I would say, firstly, don't trust necessarily tech sheets, and this is not to impute mendacity to any particular individuals, but sometimes you can compare the tech sheets for the last 3 vintages, and if the alcohol percentage doesn't change, for example, things like that don't change. You can wonder whether a certain amount of copying and pasting has gone on, and quite what. A lot. But a lot of this data, yeah, you can't really get it, and I think producers are often afraid that the reality will be misunderstood, and I've seen that time and again where producers are reticent to talk about technical matters because, they have situations. A producer in Maurice Saint-Denis had told a famous wine writer that all of the press wine was above 15% alcohol. Now, press wine is always higher in alcohol because there's sugar left, especially if you have some whole bunches, there's sugar left and it's released when you press and then it ferments, so it's higher in alcohol. But this wine writer went on to write that all of this producer's wines are above 15% alcohol. In fact, they're around 13, and so these sort of things get misunderstood, and then producers just tend to just to sort of honestly just shut down and say what they think that you want to hear. So they won't they say, we don't do any batonnage, things like that, because that's what they think people want to hear. So yeah, getting access to actual facts about how the wines are made can be challenging. I try to put a reasonable amount of that into my Burgundy notes, but you have to.
So maybe
there's not an easy answer to it.
But the trick, maybe, if someone needs to know, they can just send you a private message and you can just tell them.
Yeah, if I know, I mean,
just volunteer.
I'm happy to be indiscreet.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I do also is I send samples to labs because I have lab accounts, and so I can send samples to labs, and it's very interesting to see. I mean, we had that discussion on the forum about alcohol levels in Old Bordeaux. 1982 Mouton Rothschild at 11.49. That's very interesting. It makes you think. And similarly, I have some friends in the trade who get lab analyses of wines which are mandatory for export to certain markets and send them to me, and it could be very interesting. So I think I have a good sense of what the reality of the chemistry, at least, of top Burgundy from the leading producers today is. So that's very intriguing.
Good. Thank you. All right, Charlie, you're up again.
Really simple question from Dan, no last name. He says he sees a bottle of Thomas Pinot Noir in your background. Are you a fan?
Yeah, no, I went to visit John Thomas a couple of years ago. I wrote him a letter and he replied, and people, it's a bit like Rayas. It's one of those estates people say you can't visit, and you write the guy a letter and then they say, yeah, when do you want to go? So that was my experience, at least. Perhaps I got lucky. I found it very interesting. I mean, there's a sort of there's real character to those wines, so I gravitate towards them for sure. And I've had some age examples that were good. I wouldn't claim to be an expert, by any means. In terms of the Oregon wines I know best would be Irie for sure, in terms of older vintages, because or Jason Lett would come sometimes to present tastings at my university. So he brought a bunch of interesting old stuff all the way to the UK. So I got to get acquainted with those wines when I was a student, actually. The funny thing is, in Burgundy, you can't buy wine from other places. So I drink much less diversely now than I used to, and I suitcase things over. I buy some some Rinaldi and a few things like that from a local wine store in Bern, and I suitcase things over, and then the Burgundians remain very chauvinistic. So I serve some guys top winemaker in Volnay, three top winemakers in Volnay actually, a Ries Chardonnay blind. And everyone thought, oh, this is Merceau. Everyone said it's Merceau, and they liked it, and they were really quite impressed by it. And they were revealed, and immediately it's like, oh no, this must have been acidified, and it's just as soon as they knew that it was a Californian wine, they proceeded to totally deconstruct it. And that, yeah, that, I mean, I've opened my last bottle of 85 Montebello with people who say, oh, isn't this a bit oaky? Oh, well, yes, but says Lopez already. I mean, come on. So Château, and so is Armand Rousseau, for that matter. Particularly this 2017 Rousseau that I'm drinking right now is really surprisingly oaky, in fact.
That was one of the next questions, so good thing we cover that now. Good thing.
All right, yeah, because we would talk. 17 came up in this sort of discussion
yes.
of 18s and 19s. So I thought I'd look at one tonight, but it's surprisingly it's showing it's just a Gevrey Village, the wild import, not the. I don't know if there's a difference in the cuvées, but it's surprisingly marked by its élevage tonight. I don't know. The Roederer 14 vintage rosé is really good. That's the best young Roederer rosé vintage I tasted, I think.
Okay, thank you, Charlie.
It's you, Chris Whetstone.
Oh, I'm up. Oh, that's right. I'm up next. Thank you. All right, Chris Whetstone. I like this question because it's off of the Burgundy.
Great.
Off of Burgundy, sort of a bit. What are your views on no-dose champagne and other new trends? Is it a trend that you see continuing to spread among producers, or will it remain a more niche and geeky area of interest?
Well, it's a well-timed question because I was just reading Robert Walters' article in the latest issue of Noble Rot about just that. Does champagne need dosage to age? And he makes a very convincing case that I would agree with, that it doesn't. That it's but equally, the same things that cause a conventional still wine to be age-worthy are the same things that cause champagne to be age-worthy. That is to say, mature grapes from modest yields with good acidity levels. A lot of champagne is made with vastly overcropped, underripe fruit that is then first it's chaptalized. The Vin Clair is chaptalized to bring it up to 11% or whatever, because sugar is cheaper than champagne grapes, and then it sees sugar throughout the process of elaborating it to get it up to 12. So really talking about something that's very sort of thin and ephemeral, and it's not going to age without dosage. So I think a lot of attempts by less fastidious producers, I'm not going to say bigger houses, because there's some bigger houses doing serious things, and there's some little houses taking everybody for a ride. But I say serious producers are able to make, who farm well and grow good grapes, can make non-dosage champagnes that age like still wines. And I think that's something people find disconcerting about them. People sometimes tell me like Cedric Bouchard's wines don't age, well, because they don't sort of taste like brioche and caramel and espresso after 10 years. But does great champagne need to do that? Krug from the 1940s doesn't taste like that. And it doesn't have this sort of saccharine, artificially sweet characteristics. So I don't know. I think it's absolutely possible, but the current state of viticulture is going to limit the capability to produce age-worthy non-dosage wines to a small number of producers in summation.
Thank you.
So our next question is from Yuli K. Kind of going back to climate change and terroir. Do you think somewhat adjacent regions could reach similar heights in quality and appreciation, like Baden or Alsace?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not as well acquainted with those wines as I am with some other parts of Burgundy. I would say, I mean, within Burgundy is a big region, and already if vineyards in the Haute Côte start super overperforming, I mean, that's already a big deal. You don't even need to leave the region to see new vistas opening up for the production of really serious high quality wines. I mean, I'm kind of tempted even to buy a vineyard in the Haute Côte. Just to play around with it, because you still can, and it's very expensive to buy a vineyard in Merceau. It's very expensive. No. I mean, clearly it's changing everything. And what was the real uniqueness of Burgundy, and what was the what was the origin of the very pronounced differences in site character? Well, it was because Burgundy was a very marginal climate. So a tiny difference in exposition can really impact how well your fruit would ripen. You know, a tiny difference in altitude could really impact those things. And equally, it was such a marginal climate that you could have small yields that got fully ripe but not overripe. In a vintage like 2018 in white Burgundy, it's clear that having large vintages, having large yields was what prevented the wines from getting horribly overripe. Simply because a larger volume of grapes takes a long time to ripen, but equally with larger volume of grapes, you get less concentration. So really, if your ideal is some sort of chiseled, incisive, but concentrated wine, you do want to be in a marginal climate, and that's where quality has always been. So yeah, no, it's definitely, I mean, it's an open question as to how all of this will play out. It's also really today it's interesting because we're seeing site distinctions that are not to do so much with was the fruit ripe or not. You taste 1980 red Burgundies to harp on the theme that I've been working on lately, and there are big differences between wines made with ripe grapes and wines made with unripe grapes. Well, now all the grapes are ripe, and so the sort of distinctions we're seeing are more to do with, you know, underlying acidity levels or the character of tannins, or, you know, we're talking much more about nuances than the notion that these Grand Cru dominate village wines because they're ripe. So yeah, no, it's an interesting moment. I wouldn't know enough about other Pinot producing areas in Northern Europe to really sort of speculate as to where the next exciting place to be is, because I'm still kind of wrapped up in Burgundy. But for sure, it's going to you know, become a much more open playing field for people to do things, especially if they. But a lot of it comes down to, you know, can you sell the bottle for enough money to do the things that are necessary, and that's a great chance of being in Gevrey-Chambertin or Vosne-Romanée or wherever. Right, your selling price is really not limiting what you can do. You can do whatever you want viticulturally and in the winery, anything, and that's Burgundy's great opportunity today.
Okay, thank you. Interesting timing for this one as well. Rama Roberts asks, what are your plans for Beau Rivage? It seems to have gone dark after the 2017 Chenin Blanc.
Oh, well, no, we made 18 and 19 and 20. So in fact, we're thinking of doing a Berserkers offering of what, 17, 18 and 19, because we've got like 50 cases left of the 70, I think.
On Berserker Day?
Yes, so we
yeah, sorry, we don't have any room. There's no more room.
Oh no.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm just kidding.
No, but I like it with more bottle age. So I think that's more interesting. And if we can keep up a rotation where the wine comes out with a year's élevage on the lees and then a couple of years on the cork, I think people are going to have more fun drinking it. So, you know, happily, the Wine Advocate job came along, and sort of cash flow of all of these things became a little bit less imperative. So ideally, we can establish this sort of rhythm whereby it comes out with a couple of years bottle age, and I think I'll be pretty happy with that.
So you've got mini verticals coming up for Berserker.
Yeah, mini vertical, if you can call it that. Yeah, three vintages, but yeah.
All right.
It should be interesting. They're quite different vintages too. So.
Looking forward to it. Thank you.
So Rodrigo Braga has a question that would definitely be paid content on Wine Advocate. What are some of the under the radar up and coming producers that we should all be excited about? I guess there's no specific region, but any region you want, I guess.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, let's think. Okay. No one's heard of this one. Maxime Cotenceau in Rouilly. He worked with Vincent de Roy-Gential for a few years. I think Skernick's already bringing it in, so they're ahead of the curve. But he hasn't bottled anything yet. This really is fresh. But he made very good white Rouillys the last couple of years, and I think he's going to be a serious guy, and that's somebody, you know, I mean, outside of the Côte d'Or, which I think the Côte d'Or is so picked over. I mean, Charles Lachaud was this sort of, you know, new figure in Burgundy doing interesting things, 2-3 years ago, and the wines are now what's the market price of the Romanée Saint-Vivant? Was it? I saw it being offered for a couple of thousand the other day. So it's not, the secret's it's very hard to be ahead of the curve and in the Côte d'Or, doing the Côte de Beaune. So I hesitate. Yeah, I hesitate. What can I say in that regard? Who else is interesting though? I think there's still people who've been putting in an amazing body of work and who are not properly recognized, like Thomas Boulet and Volnay. Those are incredible wines. It's absolutely some of the very best viticulture in the whole of Burgundy. You can recognize his parcels. You walk through Volnay, I can tell you, I can find Thomas Boulet's parcels without, looking at the cadastral map or whatever. It's obvious which ones are his. And his best wine has the advantage of being Pommard Frémier, which in fact in our database, I found I was correcting some mistakes in the Wine Advocate database. It had on several occasions by predecessors been entered as Volnay Frémier. So, it's an appellation that is so little heard of that professional critics can't even, put it in the right commune. But it's fabulous wine, very old vines, slow yields, great genetics. It can age 30, 40 years, no problem. And it's really quite inexpensive compared to a lot of top flight, even at the top Côte de Beaune wines. And you're getting the best farming in the Côte de Beaune, frankly, and very, very able winemaking from a great site. So what more? There's still plenty of things like that. And I have a lot of that sort of thing in my cellar. But there's no, I can't think of a great new producer in Vosne Romanée who's about to become the next Henri Jayer. That sort of thing. I'm afraid that they're not going to be any like bargains or under the radar people who go out there producing wines that we can all buy for great prices. And I bought his Petit Moy Magnum by the case, and those days are over. We're all too late, sadly.
Okay, Chris Barton has a question. What were the Relevatory bottles or tasting experiences that set you on your wine path career?
That's fun. That's fun. Yeah. First thing was a bottle of 1955 L'Ange, which is what I think I was 17 and was first serious wine that I tasted, because my parents don't have a wine cellar. They drink wine, but they don't have a wine cellar. They don't age wine, and they don't certainly. I mean, they're continually shocked by the sort of bottles that they have no clue. They have no clue what I do really, or the sums of money that I spend on wine, which is probably for the best. But that really got my attention, and I started reading about wine. Joined a tasting group that I ended up running at university. We had producers coming, and within that time, I guess, the early ones were Bordeaux, so that 55 L'Ange, which is a very nice L'Ange. It's not a particularly profound wine, but it's certainly serious and complex. First really profound wine I had was 61 Le Mission Haut-Brion, which remains an absolute favorite wine of mine. And then Burgundy. I think some of my formative experiences in white Burgundy was 82 Le Fleuve Pucelle, which was a bin end at my Oxford college. So it's 15 UK pounds a bottle. I thought it probably passed it. It's a bit old, but we'll buy the rest. It makes good sauce was sort of the line. But then we drank a couple of dozen bottles of that. That was just, that was the true sort of plenitude of mature white Burgundy as it used to be. That was really exciting. Red. I think it's always old wines. It's always old wines that have interested me, I would say. I remember particularly a 64 Angèle Clos Vougeot that was a label that had been sold in barrel to a private customer, but they'd been given, when purchasing the barrel, also a label that said mise en bouteille par l'acheteur, so bottled by the purchaser. And they'd done a perfect job. I don't know if it was Swiss or somebody pretty serious about what they were doing. It's just incredible bottle. And those sort of experiences you get from those wines of the 60s and 50s and 40s, 30s, and frankly, the best wine I had last year was 1919 Little Lambray, an incredible wine. It wiped out 59 La Tâche. I poured 59 La Tâche. It was my late 30th birthday party. We poured 59 La Tâche. Everyone saying, "Oh, this is the best wine I've had all year, best La Tâche," etc., etc. It was a particularly good bottle, also 59 La Tâche. And then I said, "But wait, we've got something a little older, 40 years older, interesting." And what's this? It's going to be oxidized, some old fart of Williams. And then this wine just demolished the Latache. I mean, just so much more complexity and dimension. And when you taste those old Clos de l'Ambre, you understand what that site is all about, because it's not what was done in the last 30 years. It's what was done in that era. Monumental wines. La Louise Leroy almost bought the Clos de l'Ambre instead of buying the Charles Noël estate. So that would have that's a counterfactual that I love. She would have made fabulous wines. But so yes, those old wines before, you can say unreconstructed wines, pre-modern wines, and not that they weren't the product of a evolving history, because Burgundy has a lot of different embodiments over the years. In the 18th century, you're talking about very short macerations, no sulfur. The wines were only supposed to keep for a few years. By the end of the 19th century, things had moved towards a very different way of winemaking and so forth. So those wines of the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s were part of an evolving tradition. It's not just old wine and new wine by any means. But the common factor was there's no chemical fertilizers, artificial technology. Those wines were made without running water and without electricity. And it's remarkable what you can do without those things in terms of high quality winemaking. So I find that very inspiring. And I think a lot of contemporary high quality winemaking in Burgundy is going to end up being about going back to the future like that. And right now you have people going back to using vertical presses, albeit very expensive, Buca ones with pneumatically operated and stainless steel cages with little perspex cages to stop the juice shooting out if you press too hard and all that sort of thing. They cost what, 50,000 euros. But the basic thing is what people were using before they went over to pneumatic presses for red wine. That's what Ponceau used to make the 1980 Clos de la Roche that we were talking about before everyone came online. Very basic rudimentary kit that can be operated by hand. And you can purchase the same sort of wine press that Henri Jayer used, that Ponceau used back in the day, or whoever, on the French equivalent of eBay for about 50 to 100 euros, and then 250 to refurbish it. Isn't that incredible? Whereas a modern press costs you 50,000 euros. So yeah, I think those are the sort of bottles that have got me thinking a lot, and that's the sort of thought process that they've stimulated.
Thank you. That's pretty impressive. That would be expected. All right, Charlie.
So next question is from Roy Bear. Can you speak to the relative traits of 2008 and 2012 champagne, and which vintage favors a certain style over the other?
Oh yeah, I think 12 is a riper, richer, more concentrated vintage, more textural. The wines are thicker. They have real, in French say mash, in texture, chewiness in the mouth, the best 12s. Because the yields were very low, as in Burgundy. They probably wouldn't have ripened if they hadn't been as low as they were. 2008 is a bit tauter, more chiseled, both vintages have a very good spine of acidity. In 2008, there's a bit less flesh on its bones, a little bit less in the way of dry extract and ripeness. I hesitate. People like to say this is a Chardonnay vintage, this is a Pinot Noir vintage, and all that. Every vintage is a great vintage for great producers. that's the reality of it. It's about farming. And that shows whether it's the level of the Grand Marque vintage like 11 Roederer does better than let's say Pommery, to be uncontroversial. And that's always going to be the way. But I don't know, it really depends what you like. I think they're both top flight vintages, just one that's a bit richer and more textural and fleshier, more muscular, and the other that's a bit more chiseled, a little bit more austere, a little bit leaner. But they're both top flight vintages. So, if I were opening a bottle of vintage champagne for guests who didn't, weren't particularly intellectual about wine, I would go with 12, because it's that extra weight makes it that bit more approachable. But I don't know if that makes it a worse vintage. I'd hesitate to say that. That's for sure.
Thank you. All right. What's your quick take? This is from Alan Newman. Excuse me. What is your quick take on the recent Beaujolais vintages?
Yeah, it's just an interesting moment in the history of Beaujolais. economically, it's a region that's suffering immensely because we talk about a handful of producers. That lived reality, as social scientists would say, the lived experience of an average Beaujolais producer is utter misery because they either don't have wine to sell, or they do have wine to sell and no one wants to buy it. That sort of bulk market has collapsed, and this is why I try not to really be too assiduous in calling out all of the sins of a producer like such as Duboeuf, who I don't think makes particularly exciting wines. But equally, if Duboeuf goes under, I mean, life in the Beaujolais is over for a lot of producers. They're already, you drive through Fleury, you can find parcels in prime sites that are not being cultivated. This is just something that was inconceivable in Champagne-Musigny. So it's a really tough moment in the region in that sense. I think it's also a region that it's the most southern of all the regions that I cover. It's the warmest. It is a chameleon region somewhere between Burgundy and the Rhone, really, for me. And that's borne out by, you're in the land of terracotta roofs and goblet pruned vines and granite soils, and the culture is not the same as Burgundy at all. So you begin to see that, and it begins to nod more in wine style to nod more towards the Rhone. To me, Gamay tastes more and more like Grenache and less like Pinot Noir. It puts me in a difficult position because what if somebody makes a very good example of a well-made wine in that genre? The fact that I prefer wines to taste more like Pinot and less like Grenache. Should I be marking them down? I don't know. It's one of the conundrums that, as critics, we've never really defined what we do in that regard, and I don't really pretend to have the answers to it because it's a difficult question. You also see increasingly, I think it's increasingly marked by the wines. To my irritation, more and more the challenges of vinification with these sort of hotter, riper, higher sugar, lower acid grapes, especially for people wanting to do things without sulfur, which has been in some ways the lifeline of the Beaujolais. Let's also say that, because it was thanks to the low sulfur sort of natural wine movement that a lot of these regions have what little life is still extant, has been preserved. But I taste more and more wines with high levels of volatile acidity, with acetate, with Brett, with re-fermentation, and I'm over it, honestly, to be frank. I won't say the name because it's not the point, but I bought wines that I hadn't tasted, 2019s, from a producer I really love in Fleury, and they're all full of acetate. They're undrinkable. They're just undrinkable. And then they sent me, they sent me the invoice. Well, no problem from their side. And I find that very annoying. And I know that when those wines make it to the US and you order them in a wine bar in New York, then somebody's paying $120 or so for the bottle, and I paid $12. That's fine. I can eat it. But I certainly don't want. It really frustrates me. I give a wine a great review because it tastes good in the region, and it gets to New York and it's a sort of biohazard. So that's a big problem for the Beaujolais. I think it's a region facing a lot of issues. Equally, great Gamay is one of my favorite things to drink. So I don't want to be too. I realize I struck a rather negative tone for a couple of minutes there, which is perhaps not fair to the producers doing a good job. The upside is there are people, even in the sort of natural wine school of things, people who've got microscopes. They're looking at things. They're taking care, like the Tilladon brothers in Chenas. So there are people taking things seriously. They're also classic producers. Daniel Bouland or Tivin or a number of others, or Foyard, who are very, very assiduous about anything to do with microbiology, and then when wine is bad, they will sell it in bulk, and Duboeuf can process it and whatever and convert it into something saleable. I'll describe it as saleable. So there's serious stuff to be had, but it's a region that I struggle to review. I find it the most if Champagne is the most complex in the sense of I have to go between Grand Marque and little producers, and the mentality of, the Bordelais and also of the Charentais of Cognac and Bordeaux, that sort of mentality of both the business and the ways of making wines, and then to the growers, which is more like Burgundians. In Beaujolais, I would say I'm faced more with just a dilemma of what score do you give to the wine? How do you make sense of this wine? What is this wine going to do? Is what I taste what someone else is going to taste? Will people like it? Am I misleading people by giving a wine that tastes like Grenache a high score because I think it's going to taste like Pinot Noir or whatever? I find it very challenging to review, just in a very rudimentary way. But please, follow-up questions, by all means, to that, because it's a subject I'd be happy to elaborate on.
Well, in specific recent vintages, what are you thinking of some of the most recent vintages? Yeah.
It's funny that you also see in the same way that we touched on earlier, talking about how 19 Burgundy vintage had happened 10 years ago, it would have been universally acclaimed. I think the same probably would be true of 18 Beaujolais, which in terms of analysis, very, very similar to 2009, and they're very fruit driven and generous and rather supple and rather open. Easy wines for the most part. There are a few outlying monsters, and then there are a few people like Guy Breton who made wines that were all under 12.5. So they're always extremes, but for the most part, they're very fruit-driven, supple, easy wines. And I think there are actually more extreme wines in 17 and certainly in 15 than in 18. But 18 has been the lightning conductor for people to really notice that the Beaujolais is changing and say that we don't like it. I think that they're great. That 18 is a great wines to introduce people to the region who might be drinking wines from the Southern Rhone or wines from the New World, and they'll find them very appealing. That's not maybe the top vintage for Beaujolais purists, let's say. 19, there are a lot more things to be of interest to Beaujolais purists, for the same reason that 19s, I think, in the Côte d'Or are finer, livelier, more delicate, even if they have above average alcohols. I think you find the same thing. I found a lot of rather perfumed, pretty 19s that made me think of the 11s, which is another ripe vintage also. It's a ripe, sunny vintage, but balanced and dynamic and perfumed. If Gamay doesn't have something more than just fruit, I personally find it often a little tiresome. Going back 17, another powerful vintage with issues with hail and frost, which makes it heterogeneous. Some very nice wines, some they're a bit chunky and a bit high octane, a bit rustic. 16, again, hail, so some very firm, chewy, hail-tainted wines, but also some very perfumed, fine, lively, low alcohol. I mean, 16 is the last vintage you can go to where you can really find wines in that sort of older style of Gamay that tends towards Pinot in a very obvious way. So I won't go any further back than that.
That's good. Yeah. Thank you. Charlie?
So Howard Cooper had a question about how you were farming your vines, but I think you touched on that already when someone asked you about your Burgundy. So the next question is from Alan Rath. He's been following 3 Volnay producers, Bouley, Voyot, and Clerget. Can you talk about a little bit about those 3 kind of, I don't know if they're up and coming, but at least kind of newer on the scene?
I think, Bouley, as I've already mentioned, is absolutely the top viticulturalist in the Côte de Beaune, and I think an inspiration to a lot of people. He's part of the same sort of circle with guys like Charles Lachaud, Olivier Lamy, Jean-Marc Vincent and Centenay, Bruno Laurençon and Mercury, and they all exchange a lot of ideas. Also with Nico Rossignol, David Quart, those sort of guys who are very vineyard-driven, serious guys. So I'm a huge fan of his wines, and I think also he's pulling back. He's definitely somebody who embraced. I think that these guys who work really well in the vineyards sometimes end up thinking a bit too much like a plant. This is a sense that they end up focusing so exclusively on true physiological maturity that sometimes they miss the broader picture. And some of Boulay's wines in the past have sometimes gotten a bit big, a bit too chunky for their own good. Sometimes if you pick 2 or 3 days before those seeds are totally brown, you can make a better wine, I think. And there'll be winemakers who disagree with me and vineyard guys who disagree with me. But that I've tasted too many great Burgundy made from not even barely ripe grapes, to not believe that that's the case. If you drink any of those off vintage Jaillet or Pousse d'Or wines or whatever, I mean, that physiological maturity is great, but it's not the only thing to look for. So I'd say, but I get the impression that, without ever sort of admitting anything, I get the impression that Thomas is moving. His 19s are finer than his 18s. That's partly the vintage, but I think also maybe he picked them a little bit earlier relative to where they were in the ripening curve. Wayot is going through a generational transition. They have a lot of old vines. It's historic estate. They have stopped using herbicides. They've stopped using a lot of synthetic treatments, and they've had conditions that have been propitious to continue doing that. So I think it's a good thing. Very classic winemaking, I mean, I think that those are great values. They age well. Maybe they had a bit of a blip that we could go into in private, perhaps in 15 and 16. Maybe some cellar issues, but by and large, it's a very consistent address. So I think they have great appellations. And Cloget, I mean, a new producer who's been very talked about. I think he still has work to do in the vineyards. The vineyards were not well maintained before. There's a lot of herbicide. He still has to treat his Pommard Rougien with herbicide because he says the vines are too old to cultivate. He'd lose too many vines. And his father's still involved, so his father goes in and applies herbicide when he's not looking, that sort of thing. These things can be tricky. So I don't put this in writing to sort of castigate the guy. But he's making progress. I think he got all the right importers, all the right press. He worked with Charles Van Canet at Oudla Noëlla, so he had a certain style of wine when he came in. The wines are pretty impactful and dramatic, especially the first vintages. So it'll be interesting to see where he goes. I mean, he's even younger than me, I think. So he has great holdings, and I think he's committed to doing serious stuff. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think they're all interesting producers. I have some Boulay in my cellar. I have some Wayot in my cellar. I have a lot of Lafarge. That's my biggest Volnay holding, but I buy too much wine.
That transitions perfectly into the next question. Speaking of the wine that you're buying in your cellar, Colin Francesco says, what is your approach to sourcing and opening old wine, specifically old white Burgundy? There are definitely times I've seen you have 50s, 60s, 70s white Burg that have pretty low fill and quite golden color, and they turn out to be excellent.
Yeah, I mean,
he wants your secrets, I guess.
Well, the secret is to become a professional wine critic and move to Burgundy. No, but I mean, I say that partly in jest, but the reality is that it was one of the great incentives for me to move to the region was to open bottles which have fewer than 100 kilometers on the clock. So I source a lot of wine from, I would talk about serendipity. My upstairs neighbor in my apartment buys and sells cellars, so he shows me what he gets, first refusal. Sometimes I connect him with friends who want a few bottles, which works very well for him. It's much better for him than sending the wines to auction. And so and he goes all around the country. We get things from Alsace, from Brittany, always cold cellars. He goes to see the cellars, Switzerland. He just bought 240 bottles of 1978 Catillard from a cellar in Switzerland. So he finds incredible. I don't actually.
I love Catillard.
Maybe not in those old days. Sometimes I don't know. It depends. Either way, it's just incredible. You never think to see 240 bottles of Catillard from the 70s in your life. But these things do exist. There are a surprising number of these private cellars. He advertises in local newspapers in France, sort of things we would never even read. So that, these are sort of connections that I've cultivated to have access to these bottles that they go from someone's cellar to a sorting place in Burgundy generally, and then I get them. So they don't go then to Cannes to an auction or to London or wherever to an auction and then get shipped, and this just hugely increases your chances of success even with low fills. I mean, I'm more interested in color than fill. I think, those old white Burgundies often, if they're golden and lively, not a problem. It's it's especially when they've lost clarity. That's a real bad sign. Obviously you don't want it to be dark, but you really want clarity is I think the best indicator. I'd say clarity, and does it look like it's alive? You get a sort of sense for these things. So but they were robust wines, those old white Burgundies. You know, they were made very differently to the white Burgundies of today for the most part.
And there's Charlie, to you with our favorite word of late, clarity. So
that's the word that Stephen Spurrier uses to describe the aromas of Bordeaux. Because I was in the Southwold tasting group, and Stephen Spurrier said, it's kind of funny. So he would say, oh, nice clarity, and we didn't know whether he was saying it's clarity in the sense it smells like claret, or if it has some sort of clarity of aroma in it. It's not the sort of question you can ask politely.
Claret dash Y. Clarity.
Oh, clarity. The clarity.
Let's see. Jorge Enriquez had a question. I don't know if he's on anymore, but how do you kind of keep your passion level consistent for wine, since this is a job for you? You know, once a lot of people, when they turn from enthusiast to work, it no longer is fun because it becomes work.
Sure. You know, I think I'm lucky with the regions I have, for sure. I mean, Burgundy and Champagne, there's a lot to get excited about. They were the regions I would have chosen had I been given a choice. So that absolutely helps. Then, yeah, I would say that my day job is kind of the ultimate aversion therapy for the desire to drink young wine. When I'm in Burgundy, I come back from, I do 3-4 tastings a day. I try not to do more than that. I try to, being on the ground, that the idea for me is to do, not to do more, but to do better. So to spend a long time and then do fewer tastings per day, be fresher. So I do 3-4 tastings a day. I come back in the evening, I cook dinner, and I open a bottle of 30-40-year-old Burgundy, you know, almost every day of the week. But, well, to be honest, every day of the week. Let's not lie. My wife might view this replay and then maybe two bottles sometimes if we're in full confessional mode. And I find those wines very easy to drink physically. I mean, they're much more, the French say digeste. They're easy on the system. You know, the alcohols were generally lower back then also, which helps. And they're exciting. They put everything in question. You think you're tasting a 72 after having tasted a bunch of 18s. You couldn't get much more different vintages, you know. So it really makes you reflect on things. It's important to have deep context for everything, I think, in wine.
Thank you. All right. Second question from Max Swomley. We're almost done. We've only got a couple more. If you could only champion one cause in the wine world, what would it be and why? Women in wine, climate change, racial diversity, etc. Oh,
in the sense of a sort of more political thing. I mean, I think I don't claim to have any particular expertise in politics or social issues. So if I would confine myself to one thing, it would be to try to encourage people to farm better in Burgundy. To not to treat their vineyards as an entitlement, but to treat them as a responsibility. And I think advocating for better farming is not the least socially responsible thing you can do. So I feel reasonably happy with that answer.
It does seem to be happening, and also quite a bit in Champagne. The biodynamic grower movement is huge there. So, and obviously Burgundy is they're getting away from the chemicals so much more. I mean, there was like the decades of chemical use for more commercialization of it. Yeah.
You know, there's still a lot of it though, you know, and there's still a lot of herbicide. Oh, yeah. You walk through Pommard or Beaune, you see a lot of it. You know, there's plenty of Premier Cru Beaune that's machine harvested, treated with herbicides. There's also a lot of producers who they cultivate the soils a bit, but they also do a couple of passages with glyphosate a year just to sort of, you know, mean that they don't have to do as much cultivation. So the vineyards look somewhat as if they've been cultivated. The soils have been broken, but it's not true. You know, it's not true good farming, really. I mean, you know, to be honest, that's what Jadot does, and I wish they didn't. You know, it's a pity to see people spraying Roundup in the Clos des Ursule in the hillside of Beaune, and it's in plain view. So either I say it now, or someone's going to say it at some point. I mean, the day of reckoning is coming for bad viticultural practices, I think, and none too soon.
Thank you. Charlie, you're
up. Frank, I will butcher this last name. I apologize. Frank Ingressi. Sorry.
I know Frank, so I know. Yeah.
Oh, okay, perfect. You've been reviewing Burgundy for a while, so what challenges do you find reviewing Champagne in comparison, and is there much crossover between the two regions?
Yeah, I mean, I think I hinted at that earlier. For me, the challenge is not to become hugely partisan either for big houses or for growers, and to see the good things that people are doing. I think the fact that I started out my love of wine drinking a lot of Old Bordeaux really helped with that, because I can relate also to the sort of the chateau mentality. The chateau is not that dissimilar to a Grand Marque, and there's similar notions of blending, of terroir being regional rather than local, let's say, because people with big houses in Champagne will talk about, we have a terroir, it is Champagne, it is cool, and it is chalky. All right, and that's one definition. So but it's very different from the way the Burgundians understand it. So I think an awareness of the sort of Beaujolais mentality, and also I hinted at that it's not just for reasons of finance that so many cognac producers have, or that the few cognac producers have so many holdings in Champagne. It's because there are similarities in terms of aging, use of reserve wines, blending. So it's not just an analogy with Bordeaux that I found helpful. I found the analogy with the Charente very helpful too. Equally, I mean, I think I'm much better placed to intuitively understand what the best grower is doing, because that is very much explicitly inspired by Burgundy in many cases, and that's a mentality that I relate to, that I find very sympathetic. I frankly find spending 3 hours with Francis Egli more relaxing than going to taste at one of the big houses with the team of the guys and marketing reps and all the guys who want to sort of, what do you think? Egli doesn't really care what I think. Well, he does now, because we have a good rapport and there's, I think, mutual respect. But it doesn't change his world particularly. Although again, apparently they did 30%. Egli sales went up 30% after getting 100 points from me. So maybe that's not true, but he didn't know. It wasn't the red carpet. It was do you want to go and see my vineyards and talk about what I do, or not? And I like that. But I try to do justice to both sides, because if we've drunk enough great Krug and enough great Cristal to know that there's interesting wines as well, honestly, and it's not just about growers. So yeah, I'd say the hardest thing about reviewing Champagne, apart from the sheer exhaustiveness of tasting sparkling wines in large numbers, is that trying to strike a balance in what is a very bifurcated region.
Thank you. We've got one final question, and then some of us, like me, have to go make dinner for the family. So. This is from Dennis Borshahn. What is your take on Loire and her practice in growing out canopies? Genius or hippie biodynamism?
Oh no, I mean, I think it's very interesting. There's a reason more and more people are doing it, but it's very extreme, and it doesn't always. Sometimes it backfires a bit, because you trap a lot of mildew and things like that in those big canopies in humid years. We haven't had so many of those, but even in 2018, she lost a lot of crop. So some of those, she wants lower yields, yes, but I think sometimes she gets lower yields than she wants because of this approach. Someone who's, I think that there's something to be said for raising your trellising wires, for not trimming, but then if there's disease pressure, if there's a rain event, then yes, then trimming, then hedging, a very pragmatic approach to viticulture. And that's, I mean, there's a small parcel of vines that I manage in Beaune that was very badly maintained, that we're gradually rehabilitating. And that's very much the direction I'm going to be taking it in, a very pragmatic approach, also to cultivating the soil. The big thing in Burgundy that Chablis did last year was to experiment with no-till. And he got less than 10 hectoliters per hectare average yield across the domain, and the vines really looked like they were suffering because of these high densities in a very dry year. Weed competition, the vines can't survive it. So but in a very wet year, yes, it might be rather interesting. So I think there's a lot of room for a more pragmatic approach. But thankfully, we have people like Loire and others, because there are others at the same time. In fact, the first people to start doing that no hedging stuff were in the Loire, and Lalou found out about that in the Loire when she was visiting and started doing it in 1999, just for the chronology of it all. But thankfully, people have been experimenting with things like that. You could say that people haven't been experimenting enough in the period 2000 to 2015, and thankfully now that begins to change, because we sure need to try to get ahead of the curve again in terms of these hotter, drier vintages. What can we do? You know?
Okay, great. Thank you, William, for your time. That went longer than we expected, so thank you so much for taking your time answering all the questions. I want to thank everyone for joining us on this today. If you want to check William on Instagram, he's at WGFKELLEY on Instagram. You can see tons of pictures, video, information, stuff that normally would be behind paywalls for a lot of critics, but William freely gives it out to everyone, and we're all very appreciative of it. And you know, if you like what he has, please feel free to like and subscribe to Wine Advocate, and hopefully we can all do this again soon. And hope everyone has a great rest of the month and great holidays. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, William.
Yes, no, it was a real pleasure. So, good evening.
Cheers.